It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays presented to you by Film Seizure. You can catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays, but Mondays are for me to talk about monster movies. Oh boy, do I have a marvelous example of an existential race against the dread of death and the futile attempt against insanity in the form of a pale ghoul. Without a doubt, 1962's Carnival of Souls is one of my all-time favorite movies. It is so beautiful in its dreamy composition and rich photography that I really can't not watch it whenever I happen upon it on TV. What's interesting is that it's a movie that has grown on beyond its initial limited release. If you have never watched this movie, it's truly a masterpiece of early 60s horror. However, it isn't a jump out and grab you kind of horror movie. It's actually rather unsettling to watch, but not really in a bad or icky way. Carnival of Souls was written by director Herk Harvey and John Clifford. Harvey was a director of mostly educational and industrial films at a Kansas company called Centron Corporation. And he was driving back to Lawrence, Kansas after a California vacation and drove past the abandoned Saltaire Pavilion in Salt Lake City. The striking image of this abandoned carnival-like boardwalk filled his head with an idea of this final act in which our lead actress would be haunted by the place and the dozens of ghouls inside it. So, when Harvey returned from his trip, he met up with the co-worker, John Clifford, and asked him what he thought about writing the horror movie. And Harvey really didn't seem to care so much about what happened in the first two acts. He just really wanted to get to that finale at the Saltaire Pavilion. However, a spooky abandoned pavilion and a script with dancing ghouls wouldn't be really what makes Carnival of Souls so special. That would come from Harvey's discovery of New York actress and Lee Strasberg student Candace Hilligoss. Around the same time of making Carnival of Souls, Hilligoss was also offered a role in the 1963 movie Psychomania, and she decided to take the $2,000 for Carnival of Souls, and pretty much the rest was history. She has a striking appearance with very well-defined bone structure in her face and one of the most wonderful blank catatonic stares I've ever actually seen. Her big eyes tells you everything you need to know about how unnerved and terrified she is about everything going on around her. Carnival of Souls was shot in about 3 weeks at a cost of around $30,000 total. Aside from the $50 paid to shoot at the Saltaire Pavilion, many of the other shots in stores or various other real locations were done in basically a guerrilla style and done at a super brisk pace. Harvey would pay off some locals here and there to get the okay to shoot what was needed, and they would move on. In the opening scene of the movie, a drag race leads to a car going through a bridge's rails into a river. That was really shot. It wasn't done with miniatures or anything like that. And the town of Lecompton, Kansas allowed Harvey to shoot there for free. They even let him run the car through the rails. The only stipulation was that he had to replace any damaged items, and he was allowed to shoot there all he wanted. For the rails damaged by the opening scene car wreck, the production was only billed $12. Upon release, the movie slipped by many people's radars. Domestic prints of the film failed to include a copyright, which meant that the movie was instantly sent to the public domain. There are various versions of the film ranging from the 78-minute theatrical release to an 84-minute quote-unquote director's cut, although how much of an existence of the director's cut is hard to really say. Most movie theaters have only ever seen the 78-minute version, and that is for almost every time it's been played publicly. Even the Criterion Collection Blu-ray and DVD remasters are only the 78-minute version. However, a lot of televised versions would have something slightly longer than the 78-minute version. There were still some deleted scenes and stuff like that that were still able to be put back in. WOR TV in New York City would show the movie a bunch of times in the 60s during late night time slots, which would only increase its reach and its influence on up-and-coming film scholars and filmmakers. Critically, the movie didn't really receive a great deal of attention until much, much later. Some schools of thought consider it a true classic of genre filmmaking. Some would even go so far as to call it more of an art film than a true horror film, and I can't say I disagree with that assessment. I feel very snobbish when it comes to Carnival of Souls. I think of it as the height of what an extremely low budget movie could ever hope to be. Major critics would create a back of a DVD or VHS box that is loaded with nothing but positive comments about the way the movie looks and feels. The movie follows Mary Henry from Kansas, and the movie opens with her riding in a car with two friends. They are challenged to a drag race by a carload of guys. The girl's car plunges into the river off of that bridge. After hours of searching, Mary somehow stumbles out of the river, but is not really sure what happened and can't really remember anything. She eventually relocates to Salt Lake City, where she has a job as a church organist. However, she begins to be haunted by a ghoulish man played by the director Herk Harvey. She sometimes even becomes inaudible and invisible to the world around her, as if she doesn't actually exist. She ultimately gets herself fired from her new organist position at a church when she uncontrollably switches from playing a hymn to playing something much more eerie that seems to just kind of flow out of her. The minister decides that this is blasphemous and releases her. All the while, she finds herself drawn to an abandoned pavilion where she eventually is confronted by the man and his ghoul friends. As her world fractures around her, she tries getting help from a doctor who agrees to try to understand what's going on with her. She even tries leaving Salt Lake City, only to realize that her attempt to leave was only a dream. In the end, she's drawn back to the pavilion where the man and several other ghouls wait for her, and the movie swells to a fascinating conclusion. For my three things, I have to try to find the big picture stuff I like. That's because there's so many damn things, big and small, that I could point to as a thing that I truly love about this movie. And I think the first thing I have to say is the atmosphere of the movie itself. It is essentially like watching a dream play out. Something is there, then isn't. Attitudes shift and contort. Then when it comes to the Saltaire, it is this gorgeous, eerie, quiet, and utterly empty place. Every scene in that place, I feel like I'm almost like in a sensory deprivation tank. It just feels so dead and so quiet. There's this feel to the movie that almost makes you think that you are there with Mary trying to understand this dreamlike world you're in. It feels cold, and while it was released near the end of September, it was filmed the previous September in 1961, where you would think it would be maybe a little bit warmer in Kansas. And it still feels like a place that is shutting down in fall just before winter. It is quite possibly one of the few films outside those Universal classics that place me right into the mood and its setting by its visuals. Second, without giving away anything about the ending of this movie, the story of Carnival of Souls is utterly fascinating to me on every possible level. It deals with, souls. It deals with almost floating through the world and seemingly untethered by mortality. It deals with life and death in general, as well as the emotion and lack of desire. Now, this will be a little bit of a stretch for some, and it also has a little bit of a deep cut when it comes to references, but this reminds me of a limited comic book series called Midnight Nation, written by J. Michael Straczynski. It ran from 2000 to 2002, right in the glory days of my return to comic book collecting, and when I was most thirsty to try new things. In a lot of ways, the main character in that series, David Gray, is very similar to Mary Henry. They both have basically faded out of sync with the world for different reasons, but I don't think it's too far of a stretch to tie Midnight Nation to Carnival of Souls. In fact, if I ever met Straczynski, I'd ask him if this movie was in some way influential to that comic. I wouldn't be surprised one bit, as Carnival of Souls has been cited as a major influence for filmmakers such as David Lynch, George Romero, and even James Wan. Finally, Candace Hilligoss is amazing in this. As I mentioned earlier, she has a very striking look to her. She has a very defined jawline and cheekbones. She's pretty, but also very Midwestern pretty. She's not overly glamorous, but still someone you have to keep your eyes on. And speaking of eyes, there are times in which her big round eyes are just staring in disbelief or shock or horror, and just by seeing it, you know everything she's thinking and reacting to is breaking down her sanity. What's even better is she's guiding you through this movie too. You're both aware that something isn't right. Something is off in the world or with her. You're finding that out together. One of the great things about Carnival of Souls is that you don't know exactly what to attribute to the greatness of it. Sometimes you can say a particular performance carries a movie all the way through all its imperfections. Meanwhile, other movies have a particular vision that carries it over potentially awkward performances and so forth. Here, it's obvious the script is fascinating. It's plain to see how the movie was shot to elicit certain feeling and mood. It's clear that Herk Harvey had a plan for how it was going to be structured and what he wanted from the actors. Even with as good as Hilligoss is, she's just one piece of this perfection that this movie turned out to be. In the end, neither Herk Harvey nor Candace Hilligoss was really able to turn Carnival of Souls into a career-launching event as it should have been. Hilligoss would appear in Del Tenney's Curse of the Living Corpse that also had Roy Scheider and a few TV appearances for her, but that's really it. Sometimes she would go to conventions or speak about Carnival of Souls, but she really didn't get to go too much further than being the lead in a quickly forgotten movie that later became a favorite of a guy who turns his nose up at anyone who doesn't think this movie is an out-and-out masterpiece. For Herk Harvey, he passed away in 1996, only really getting to hear all the love that his one feature-length movie received, as that was gaining traction in the late 80s. He really didn't get to see it restored so gloriously by Criterion or see it preserved by the Academy Film Archive. After making Carnival of Souls, he went back to work on industrial and education films. Though I should make mention that he is the director of one of the very best industrial safety shorts ever, Shake Hands with Danger. And if you're a fan of riff tracks, you know that short very well.
Shake hands with danger.
Shake hands with danger.
But alas, he at least got to celebrate the appreciation of his feature film in his final years. If you haven't seen this movie, I cannot urge you enough to check it out. It's so full of beautiful cinematography and so nicely subtle in every right possible way that makes this more of an art project you cannot peel your eyes away from. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Until next week, I'll see you later. And don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com, as well as check out new posts at my website, B Movie Enema, each and every Friday morning.